And it really was. It was music was in the soul up there, and it still is. And
you don't really think about it,
Mommy,
until it happens.
Gayle. So 8. I counted 8. Is that correct?
yeah, I think.
We didn't miss
Isn't that
any.
enough?
Most people remember Crystal Gayle for her impossibly long hair and the silky smooth ballad, "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue?" But behind that glamorous image lies a story full of pressure, defiance, and choices that could have ended her career before it even began. Crystal wasn't born a superstar. She was born Brenda Gayle Webb in Paintsville, Kentucky, the youngest of 8 children in a coal miner's family. That alone should have been enough to shape her destiny as just another small-town girl lost in the shadows. Except Brenda had an older sister, whose name was already being shouted across every radio in America, Loretta Lynn. From the start, Crystal's identity was tied to one of the most powerful female voices country music had ever known. And while it opened doors, it also trapped her in expectations that nearly suffocated her. Growing up, she was taught resilience the hard way. Her father worked himself into an early grave in the coal mines, dying when Crystal was only 8. Her mother, determined not to let her children sink into poverty, moved the family to Indiana in search of better opportunities. In that new environment, Brenda found herself torn between ordinary teenage life and the looming shadow of Loretta's rise to fame. By the time she was in high school, Loretta was already dominating the charts, and everyone looked at Brenda as the next Lynn. That label became both a blessing and a curse. Crystal's first real shot came when Loretta brought her to Nashville and helped her land a record deal. But the catch was immediate and brutal. Every producer wanted her to sing like her sister. Instead of being celebrated for her own talent, she was pressured to mimic Loretta's raw Appalachian sound. The problem? Crystal's natural voice was nothing like Loretta's. Where Loretta had grit and twang, Crystal's tone was smooth, polished, and more suited for the emerging country pop wave. Industry insiders dismissed her, whispering that she lacked the authenticity of her sister. Even fans who expected a second Loretta Lynn were skeptical. For a while, Crystal was caught in limbo. Too different to satisfy traditional country gatekeepers, too unproven to win over new audiences, she might have faded into the background, forgotten as just Loretta's little sister. But instead, she made a daring decision. She refused to compete with her sister's style. Crystal would carve out her own identity, even if it meant walking away from Nashville's traditions. That choice didn't pay off instantly, but it set her on a path that would eventually shake up the entire country music scene. The first real battle she faced was surviving those early years of rejection and finding the confidence to stay true to herself. After making that bold choice to step out of her sister's shadow, Crystal Gayle found herself at the crossroads every young artist dreads, a contract without identity. The Nashville machine kept nudging her toward Loretta's mold, insisting that audiences only wanted another coal miner's daughter. But Crystal knew deep down that copying her sister would only guarantee she was always second best, so she tried something radical for that time. She leaned into her smooth, polished vocals and embraced a sound that critics didn't yet know how to label. It wasn't quite traditional country, but it wasn't full pop either. That in-between lane was risky, and for years it didn't look like it was going to work. Her first singles barely made a dent. Songs like "I've Cried the Blue Right Out of My Eyes" received modest attention, but they weren't enough to separate her from the giant shadow of Loretta. Radio programmers often introduced her music with the line, "Loretta Lynn's little sister," as if her talent alone wasn't enough to justify airtime. For Crystal, those words stung every time she heard them. In interviews years later, she admitted that the pressure to live up to her family name was one of the toughest battles of her career. Behind the scenes, she faced another invisible battle. Producers and label executives doubted her crossover instincts, urging her to stick closer to the real country formula. It was a man's world in the music business, and female artists were expected to play by the rules, not bend them. Crystal, though soft-spoken in public, was quietly stubborn. She kept experimenting, taking advice but also pushing against it, trying to mold her style into something that reflected who she was. It was a lonely road. Loretta was supportive, but she had her own career to maintain. Crystal had to prove herself without leaning too hard on her sister's fame, and that meant walking a tightrope where one wrong move could end everything. Through these years of struggle, one thing became clear. Crystal had a vision. She believed that country music could be more than just honky-tonk laments and twangy heartbreak ballads. She wanted it to sound lush, elegant, even glamorous, something that could appeal to women who loved Nashville and city crowds who tuned in to pop radio. But with every failed single and lukewarm response, the industry seemed to mock her for trying. She's chasing something that doesn't exist, some critics whispered. Yet Crystal held on, convinced that somewhere out there was a song that would unlock her true potential. And then, almost by accident, that song arrived. In the summer of 1977, Crystal Gayle walked into a Nashville studio to record what was supposed to be just another session. The song in question, Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue, had been offered to her by songwriter Richard Lee, and at first, it didn't seem destined to change her life. Crystal had recorded plenty of songs before that failed to make waves, and this one felt no different. But something happened during that first take. Her voice, smooth as velvet, carried a natural ache that couldn't be rehearsed or replicated. When she finished, the producers suggested another run, but Crystal couldn't match the magic of that first pass. In the end, it was the original take, raw, haunting, effortless, that made its way onto the record. That single decision would forever alter the course of her career. The moment the song hit the airwaves, it was like the world stopped to listen. Country fans adored it, but what surprised everyone was how quickly it crossed over to mainstream pop stations. Suddenly, Crystal Gayle was no longer just Loretta Lynn's younger sister or a struggling country hopeful. She was a breakout star in her own right. Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue shot to #1 on the country charts, cracked the Billboard Hot 100, and eventually won her a Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. It wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural moment, the kind of song that defined an era. For Crystal, the success was both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, she had finally proven herself. She had taken the risk of embracing her natural style, and it paid off bigger than she could have imagined. On the other hand, she was suddenly under a new kind of scrutiny. Everyone wanted to know if she could deliver another hit of the same caliber. Industry insiders whispered that she had stumbled onto a once-in-a-lifetime stroke of luck. Critics doubted she could sustain the momentum. The pressure once again was suffocating. But Crystal wasn't about to let the song define her as a one-hit wonder. Instead, she leaned into the success and rode the wave with confidence. She followed up with hits like Talking in Your Sleep and Half the Way, proving that her polished, crossover-friendly style wasn't a fluke. It was the future. Fans adored the way her music blended sophistication with emotion, and she became a household name, performing on national television and touring internationally. By the late 1970s, she had achieved something that seemed impossible only a few years earlier. She had stepped out of her sister's shadow and built a legacy of her own. By the end of the 1970s, Crystal Gayle was no longer just a rising star. She was a phenomenon. Her albums were going platinum. She was selling out tours, and she was the first female country artist to ever achieve that level of commercial success. Audiences loved her elegant stage presence, her long hair that became a signature, and most of all, her ability to deliver songs that sounded just as comfortable on pop radio as they did on the Grand Ole Opry stage. For a brief moment, it seemed like Crystal had cracked the code. She had figured out how to unite two worlds that rarely mixed. But in Nashville, not everyone celebrated her triumph. Country purists were uneasy with the idea of smooth strings, jazz-infused chords, and lush production overtaking the twang and grit they believed defined the genre. Some insiders dismissed her as too pop, or accused her of abandoning her roots. It was the same criticism that had dogged artists like Patsy Cline before her, and later Shania Twain and Faith Hill would face it as well. But in Crystal's time, the backlash was particularly sharp because she was Loretta Lynn's sister, a woman whose reputation was built on being the very embodiment of authentic country storytelling. Comparisons were inevitable, and some traditionalists couldn't resist framing Crystal as the polished counterpart who had turned her back on the coal-dust truth of her upbringing. The tension didn't stop her momentum, though. Instead, Crystal leaned into her crossover appeal, releasing hit after hit. Talking in Your Sleep, Why Have You Left the One You Left Me For, and Half the Way. She was winning major awards, including Female Vocalist of the Year from the Country Music Association and even landed her own variety specials on television. International audiences adored her. She performed everywhere from Europe to Japan, bringing country music into spaces it had never reached before. Behind the glamour, however, was the constant pressure of expectation. Every album had to top the last. Every song had to be as big as Brown Eyes. And when a single didn't chart as high, critics circled like vultures, eager to declare that her crossover success had run its course. For Crystal, this balancing act was exhausting. She had to smile through interviews, maintain the perfect image, and keep pushing forward, even as whispers about her not being country enough grew louder. What many fans didn't see was that Crystal wasn't afraid to take risks. She wasn't content to be trapped by formulas or boxed in by purist demands. She began experimenting with gospel, standards, and even jazz influences, making choices that baffled critics but spoke to her desire for artistic freedom. Those risks didn't always pay off on the charts, but they showed a side of her that went beyond chasing hits. As the 1980s unfolded, Crystal chose to take risks that surprised both her fans and her critics. Rather than chasing chart dominance at all costs, she started exploring other sides of her artistry. She recorded gospel songs, covered jazz standards, and even leaned into lush, almost cinematic arrangements that went far beyond what Nashville had come to expect from its stars. For some, these experiments looked like detours. For Crystal, they were lifelines, a way of staying true to herself while refusing to be boxed in. The industry didn't always reward her for it. Not every project soared on the charts. Some critics dismissed her choices as indulgent or misguided. But what her detractors missed was the quiet resilience behind those decisions. Crystal wasn't just trying to make hits, she was building a legacy on her own terms. At the same time, she was juggling another challenge, her personal life. Crystal had married Bill Gatzimos in the early 1970s, long before she became a superstar, and the couple had 2 children. Unlike many artists who lived entirely on the road, Crystal tried to balance her music with motherhood. Stories from those years reveal her devotion. She would perform for massive audiences and then retreat backstage to breastfeed her baby before heading out again. It was a rare, almost hidden glimpse of the woman behind the glamorous gowns and long, flowing hair. For Crystal, success wasn't just about topping charts. It was about protecting the things that mattered most, even if that meant slowing her career to make space for family. Her ventures outside of music also spoke to this desire for stability. She opened a jewelry store and gift shop, invested in projects that gave her financial independence, and built a world where she wasn't reliant solely on the fickle tides of radio play. To some, it looked like she was stepping away from the spotlight. To others, it was proof that she was savvy enough to prepare for life after the hits. And through it all, she never lost the love of performing. She kept touring, connecting with fans, and proving that her voice, no matter the genre, still carried the same velvet smoothness that had made her famous. On stage, Crystal Gayle was the picture of elegance. Her voice floated across sold-out arenas, her floor-length hair shimmered under the lights, and fans saw nothing but confidence. But away from the spotlight, the reality was more complicated. Being Loretta Lynn's younger sister was a blessing and a burden that never fully went away. Loretta was the outspoken, rough-edged trailblazer, and Crystal was the softer, glamorous crossover star. The media couldn't resist comparing the two, often hinting at a rivalry that neither sister wanted to fuel. Crystal has admitted in interviews that, like any siblings, they had their disagreements. There were times when words were exchanged, when family tensions ran high, but she also insisted that the bond always held stronger than the bickering. Still, the narrative of 2 sisters competing for country's crown followed her for decades. The industry didn't make it easier. Executives and critics played into those comparisons, sometimes framing Crystal as the inauthentic one, because her music leaned toward pop. Male producers especially pushed back on her desire to experiment, suggesting she stay closer to Loretta's style if she wanted longevity. In a business dominated by men, Crystal had to fight subtle battles just to be taken seriously as her own artist. Fans might not have noticed the power struggles behind closed doors, but the pressure was constant. Every choice she made was dissected, from the songs she recorded to the way she dressed on stage. And then there were the rumors, whispers about tension with Loretta, speculation about whether she regretted choosing the polished route, instead of the raw authenticity that defined her sister. Tabloids exaggerated every small family disagreement, painting a picture of a feud far larger than reality. But what fans often overlooked was the quiet strength it took for Crystal to keep her personal life private. She didn't feed into the gossip mills. She didn't air her grievances in interviews. Instead, she carried herself with calmness, even when the headlines tried to stir the pot. Yet the emotional toll of balancing fame and family was real. Crystal had 2 young children to raise, and she wanted to be present for them. Unlike many stars who let the road consume their lives, she fought to keep her family intact. That meant making sacrifices, turning down tours, choosing smaller projects, or stepping back from recording at times when the industry expected her to push harder. For an artist who had clawed her way to the top, those choices weren't easy, but they reflected her priorities. She wasn't going to let fame dictate every corner of her life. Even with these pressures, Crystal's career endured. She didn't implode the way some stars did under similar weight. Instead, she carried on quietly, proving that you could succeed in country music without constant scandal or flameouts. But behind the composed image, she was still navigating questions of identity, comparisons to her sister, and the burden of being a woman trying to stay relevant in an industry that often chewed up its brightest talents. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, her name wasn't dominating the charts anymore, but her influence was undeniable. The industry that once criticized her began to recognize the groundbreaking role she had played in shaping modern country pop. As the years moved forward, Crystal Gayle's chart-topping streak naturally slowed, but her career never disappeared. It simply transformed. By the 1990s, she was no longer competing with the newest radio darlings, but she didn't need to. Her place in music history was already secure. She began leaning into projects that reflected her artistry, rather than chasing commercial dominance. She recorded gospel albums, classic standards, and duets that showcased her versatility. Each project reminded fans that her voice was more than a vehicle for hits. It was a timeless instrument capable of adapting to any genre. While the mainstream spotlight shifted to younger stars, Crystal's reputation as one of the most graceful and enduring performers in country music only grew stronger. Recognition soon followed. In 2009, she received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a rare honor for a country artist. Then in 2017, she reached a milestone many fans felt was long overdue. She was officially inducted into the Grand Ole Opry. That night, standing on the same stage where she had once been dismissed as too polished and too pop, Crystal was welcomed as a pillar of country tradition. The irony wasn't lost on longtime fans. The same industry that had once questioned her authenticity now celebrated her as a legend. It was a vindication that proved her gamble, choosing her own path instead of copying Loretta's, had been worth it. Even in later years, Crystal refused to fade into nostalgia. In 2019, she released a new album, You Don't Know Me, Classic Country, produced with the help of her son, Christos. The record was a return to her roots, but on her terms, blending the traditional sounds of her upbringing with the polish that defined her career. It was both a tribute to the past and a statement of continuity, showing that she still had stories to tell. For fans who had grown up with her, the album was a reminder of why they fell in love with her music in the first place. For younger listeners, it was an introduction to an artist whose influence stretched across decades. Beyond the studio, her impact was clear in the new generation of female stars who followed. Shania Twain, Faith Hill, Martina McBride, and countless others benefited from the path Crystal blazed, a lane where women could embrace glamour, cross into pop, and still be taken seriously in Nashville. Without Crystal's success, the industry might not have been as open to those crossover sounds that later dominated the charts. She had done the hard work of proving it could be done, and though it came at the cost of criticism and skepticism, the doors she opened remained wide for others. Today, Crystal Gayle is celebrated not just as Loretta Lynn's sister, not just as the woman with the iconic long hair, but as an artist who quietly rewrote the rules. She didn't need scandals or public feuds to cement her place. Instead, she relied on talent, vision, and persistence. And while the flash of her pop country reign has long passed, her voice still echoes in every artist who dares to blur the lines between country tradition and mainstream appeal. Looking back, Crystal Gayle's story is more than just the tale of a woman who sang one of the most iconic songs in country history. It's a story about carving out an identity when the world tries to define you by someone else's success. From the coal dust hills of Kentucky to the glamorous stages of international arenas, she carried both the weight of family expectations and the skepticism of an industry that didn't quite know what to do with her. She was expected to be Loretta Lynn's copy, and when she refused, she risked everything. Yet that defiance became her greatest strength. By choosing her own sound, she created a lane where country music could expand, blending elegance with emotion and opening doors for generations of artists after her. Her journey also reveals something rarely discussed in the music world: the quiet sacrifices behind the fame. While fans adored the velvet smoothness of her voice, Crystal was juggling a family, a marriage, and the scrutiny of critics who often underestimated her. She didn't self-destruct under the pressure or feed the tabloids with scandal. Instead, she built her career with a rare balance of grace and determination. For every chart-topping hit, there was a moment backstage where she was simply a mother tending to her children. For every glamorous television appearance, there was the quiet businesswoman building stability outside of music. That duality is what made her unique. She was both superstar and survivor, and she made both roles look effortless. Even the so-called feuds and rivalries that the media loved to exaggerate never defined her. Crystal never allowed bitterness to eclipse her artistry. Her relationship with Loretta had its ups and downs, as all siblings do, but the bond endured, and both women left their mark in ways that complemented rather than canceled each other. Where Loretta embodied raw, unfiltered country storytelling, Crystal embodied refinement and crossover ambition. Together, they broadened what it meant to be a woman in country music. Today, Crystal Gayle stands not just as a relic of the past, but as a living reminder of resilience. She may not dominate the charts anymore, but her influence runs deep in the DNA of modern country pop. Every time a female artist pushes the boundaries of the genre, blending traditional roots with mainstream sounds, you can trace that lineage back to Crystal's gamble in the 1970s. That is her legacy, the quiet trailblazer who didn't shout or fight her way to the top, but who still changed the rules simply by being true to herself. So how should we remember Crystal Gayle? As the girl with the impossibly long hair? The voice behind "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue"? The younger sister of Loretta Lynn? Or perhaps something more? The proof that sometimes the boldest act in life is refusing to be defined by anyone else's story. And in doing so, she not only gave us unforgettable music, but also a lesson in independence that still resonates today. Crystal Gayle carved out her own identity in a world that tried to define her by someone else's success. She proved that staying true to yourself, even when everyone tells you otherwise, can rewrite the rules of an entire industry. Her story reminds us that behind every glamorous facade lies a human being navigating complex pressures, making difficult choices, and fighting for the right to be themselves. Crystal Gayle did all of this with a grace and determination that left an indelible mark on country music, and her influence continues to inspire artists who refuse to be confined by others' expectations. If you enjoyed learning about Crystal Gayle's incredible journey from Loretta Lynn's little sister to a country music legend in her own right, please give this video a like. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of Crystal's story resonated most with you? And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of music's greatest artists who dared to break the rules and forge their own paths to stardom.